The auctioneer grabbed Clara's wrist and yanked her forward so hard she nearly fell off the platform. "Last one," he announced, not even bothering to say her name. "Somebody take her, or she sleeps in the snow tonight." The crowd laughed. A man in a fur coat called out, "Not worth the firewood." Clara did not cry. She had run out of tears 3 winters ago. She just stood there, shaking, staring at the frozen mud below the platform, and told herself this was simply how her story ended. She was wrong. If this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Black Pine Ridge, Montana, the winter of 1874, and find out what happens when the most feared man in the northern Rockies walks up to an auction block and says the 4 words that stunned an entire town. The auctioneer's name was Horace Dunn, and he had been running bride auctions in Black Pine Ridge for 6 years without a single moment of shame. He called it a placement service. Everyone else called it what it was. Clara Whitmore had arrived at the platform that morning the same way she had arrived at every difficult moment in her 24 years, alone, underprepared, and carrying far less than she needed. Her cloth bag held a spare dress, a broken comb, a Bible with the front cover torn off, and a small folded letter she had stopped reading because the words inside hurt too much. Horace had looked her over the way a man looks at a horse he already knows he cannot sell. "You sick?" he asked. "I was," Clara said. "I'm better now." "You look like you ain't better." She didn't argue. There was no point arguing with the truth. He put her at the end of the line. The auction had started at sunrise, which, in Montana territory in November, meant the sky was still the color of iron, and the wind came off the mountains like something that wanted to kill you. Clara stood in that wind for 3 hours watching the other women get chosen. Some of them cried. Some of them looked relieved. Some of them looked the way Clara felt like they had long ago stopped expecting anything good and were simply waiting to find out how bad the next thing would be. One by one the line shortened. One by one Clara remained. By the time Horace called her name, there were only a handful of men left in the crowd, and most of them were there for entertainment rather than intention. She could tell by the way they held their cups of whiskey. Men who were seriously looking for wives held their hats. These men held their drinks. "Clara Whitmore," Horace announced to the mostly empty platform space. "Age 24, no family, no property, carries a debt of $42 to the Black Pine General Store which the buyer will be expected to absorb." Someone in the crowd said, "That's all she comes with, debt and a cough." Laughter moved through the group like water finding the lowest point. Clara kept her eyes on the frozen mud below the platform. She had learned a long time ago that looking at people who were laughing at you only encouraged them. "Opening bid is set at $20, Horace said without much conviction. Silence. He tried again. 15. More silence. "Gentlemen, the woman needs a home before this storm rolls in. $10 and the debt absorbed. Someone show some Christian charity." A heavy-set man in a beaver coat, Samuel Briggs, who owned 2 of the 4 saloons in Black Pine Ridge, and approximately none of the decency in the entire territory, called out from the back. "I'll give you 5 for her. Put her to work scrubbing floors until she pays off that debt herself." More laughter. Clara's hands tightened around the cloth bag. She was not going to cry. She had made herself that promise before she climbed onto the platform. Whatever happened up here, she was not going to give these people the satisfaction of watching her break. $5, Horace repeated with the specific exhaustion of a man who knows he's losing. "Do I have 6? That was when the crowd shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in stories where the music swells and everyone turns at once. It happened the way things happen in real life, quietly, with a kind of weight that you feel before you understand it. A man walked out of the space between 2 buildings at the far edge of the gathered crowd. He moved without hurrying, which was somehow more commanding than if he had pushed through quickly. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated way that people describe men in tall tales, but in the real, functional way that comes from decades of hard physical work in hard physical places. His coat was dark wool, His boots were worn but solid, and his beard had the kind of length that suggested he had not been near a town in some time by choice, rather than circumstance. Clara noticed him because the men around him stepped back slightly, without seeming to realize they were doing it. He walked to the table at the base of the platform, where Horace kept his ledger and his cash box, and he set down a leather pouch that landed with the specific heavy sound of serious money. "Count it," the man said. "It's enough to cover the girl's debt and whatever your fee is, and whatever you think is fair on top of that." Horace stared at the pouch. Then he looked up at the man. Then he looked back at the pouch. "Mr. Carter," he said with the careful tone of someone who knows a man's reputation and respects it in the way you respect weather. "I wasn't expecting you this far down the mountain." "Evidently," Elias Carter said. He looked up at Clara then, not the way the other men had looked at her, not assessing, not amused, not calculating. He looked at her the way you look at someone you're speaking to. Like she was a person, and he was acknowledging that fact. "Is she going with Briggs?" he asked Horace without looking away from Clara. "She wasn't going anywhere until you showed up," Horace admitted. "Then it's settled." Elias turned back to the ledger table. "Write it down properly. I want a record that her debt is cleared and the sale is complete." Samuel Briggs pushed forward from the back of the crowd. He was a big man in the soft way that men get big when they have money and other people to do their physical work, and he wore that size like a threat he had never actually had to make good on. "Hold on now, Carter," Briggs said. "I had an interest. You had $5 and a plan to put a sick woman to work scrubbing your floors," Elias said, still not raising his voice. "That ain't the same thing as an interest." "I was going to bid higher." "You weren't." Elias picked up the completed receipt that Horace had scrawled and folded it into his coat pocket. "You were going to wait until she got desperate enough to come to you. That's how you operate." He finally looked at Briggs directly. "We both know it." Briggs's face did something complicated. The crowd had gone quiet enough that you could hear the wind working at the gaps in the wooden buildings. "You're wasting your money on something that won't last the winter," Briggs said, and the words were aimed past Elias at Clara in the specific way that cruel people aim words so the target knows they were meant to land. Clara felt them land. She always did. That was the thing about a lifetime of being told you weren't worth much. You got very good at absorbing it, but you never got entirely used to it. Elias didn't respond to Briggs. He turned back to Clara, and he did something that nobody in that crowd expected. He walked up the 2 steps of the platform and stood in front of her, and he took off his hat. The gesture was so simple and so deliberate that the remaining crowd went absolutely still. "My name is Elias Carter," he said. "I have a cabin about 12 miles north of here. You're welcome to come there and stay through the winter or longer, or until you figure out what you want to do next. That's your choice to make." Clara stared at him. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You just paid a great deal of money." "I did." "Don't you want something in return?" Elias looked at her steadily. His eyes were dark and very calm, the eyes of a man who spent most of his time in places where pretending wasn't useful. "My first rule," he said loudly enough that the people around them could hear it clearly, "is that you don't owe me a single thing. Not labor, not company, not gratitude beyond what you feel naturally. You are not a debt I purchased. You are a person who needed a way out of a bad situation, and I had the means to provide it." He paused. "That's all this is." The laughter that had been sitting in the crowd like a held breath simply dissolved. Nobody spoke. Samuel Briggs opened his mouth and then closed it again. Clara looked at this enormous, weathered, completely serious stranger and tried to find the angle. There was always an angle. Every offer she had ever received had carried a hidden cost, a fine print a moment down the road, where the person who helped her would remind her of what she owed and exactly how she was going to pay it back. She searched his face for it. She could not find it. "Why?" she asked. Elias put his hat back on. "Because nobody else was going to," he said simply. "And someone should have." He turned and walked back down the platform steps, and after a moment, because there was nothing else to do, because the alternative was Briggs's $5 and a floor to scrub, because some part of her that was more stubborn than frightened said move. Clara picked up her cloth bag and followed him. The crowd parted for Elias, the way water parts for something that knows where it's going. Clara walked through the same parting and kept her eyes forward and did not look at Samuel Briggs, though she felt his gaze on her back like a hand she hadn't given permission to be there. They reached Elias's horse at the hitching post outside the general store, and he untied the reins and handed her a heavy blanket from the saddlebag without explanation. "It'll get colder before we reach the tree line," he said. She took the blanket. "You knew you were going to need an extra blanket." "I brought two." She looked at him. "You plan to bring someone back." He checked the cinch on the saddle. "I had a feeling about today." "What kind of feeling?" He glanced at her briefly, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but settling like a door that has been opened slightly, deciding whether to open further. "The kind that says stay in town a little longer than you meant to." Clara wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and didn't say anything else for a moment. Behind them, the crowd had begun to disperse, and she could hear Briggs talking loudly to someone about the price of mules, making clear with his volume that he was unbothered by what had happened, which was precisely how bothered men acted when they were. "I should tell you," Clara said. "I'm not as sick as I looked up there. I had a fever last week, but it broke. I can work. I'm good with numbers, and I can cook, and I can—" "Miss Whitmore." Elias's voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "I meant what I said. You don't have to convince me of your usefulness. You can start doing that when we're on the trail if it makes you feel better, but I want you to understand that it isn't required." Clara pressed her lips together. The habit of justifying her own existence was so deep that being told not to do it felt almost destabilizing. Like being told you didn't have to hold your breath underwater, the body kept holding anyway, because the body remembered danger even when the mind said it was safe. "It might take me some time," she said finally, to believe that. Elias nodded, like she had said something sensible. "That's fair," he said. "Take all the time you need." They rode north into the mountains. The sky had gone the color of pewter, heavy with the storm that had been threatening all morning, and the trail wound through pine trees so tall they blocked the worst of the wind. Clara sat behind Elias on the horse and kept the blanket tight and watched the town of Black Pine Ridge disappear behind them, swallowed by the curve of the mountain and the thickening trees. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her she wanted to keep. What she carried instead was the weight of a lifetime's worth of lessons about what it meant when a man offered you something without explaining the cost. Her mother had taught her that lesson first by example, a woman who had accepted one too many kind offers from men who turned cruel and who had spent the rest of her short life paying the price. Clara had watched and learned and spent her entire adult life being careful, being useful, being small enough not to be worth the trouble of targeting. And somehow she had still ended up on an auction platform in a freezing Montana town with $42 of debt and 5 men laughing at her. She thought about what Elias had said, because nobody else was going to, and someone should have. There was no angle in those words that she could find. She had turned them over a dozen times already on the trail, and they stayed flat and honest no matter which way she looked at them. That frightened her almost as much as Briggs's $5 had. Kindness with a visible price tag, she understood. Cruelty with a clear purpose, she understood. This a large, quiet stranger removing his hat on an auction platform and telling her she didn't owe him anything. This was something she had no category for. The snow began falling just after noon, the first flakes drifting sideways through the pines, and Elias urged the horse to move faster without saying anything about it. He knew this mountain the way Clara had never known any place with the ease of someone whose body had memorized the ground. "Have you lived up here long?" she asked, partly because she wanted to know, and partly because the silence felt enormous. 14 years, he said. Alone. A pause. Mostly. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who gets lonely." "That's because you don't know me yet," he said. And there was something in his voice she couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, but the echo of something that had been sadness once, and had been living with the memory of it for long enough that it had gone quiet. Clara decided not to push further. She had her own silences that she didn't want pried at. She could respect his. The cabin appeared through the trees as the snow thickened, and Clara understood immediately why Elias had survived 14 years alone up here. The place was built with the same kind of quiet competence that characterized the man himself. Solid, practical, not a single thing wasted. He helped her down from the horse with a steadying hand and said nothing about it, and she was grateful for the fact that he didn't make it into something. Inside the cabin was warm. He had clearly banked the fire before leaving that morning, and Clara stood just past the threshold and looked at the room and felt something complicated move through her chest. There was a bed near the fireplace, made up with clean blankets. Fresh clothes folded on the chair beside it. A pot of something on the stove that smelled like soup. She turned to look at Elias, who was hanging his coat by the door, with the manner of a man performing a completely ordinary action. "You prepared this," she said. "I had time this morning. You set up a bed, you made soup, you brought extra blankets." "I did." "Elias." She stopped. She had not meant to use his first name and wasn't sure when she had decided to. "Why did you come to that auction today?" He turned from the coat hook and looked at her steadily. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, covering the mountain in the particular silence that only heavy snowfall creates. "I came to town for supplies," he said. "But I'd heard about the placement service. I'd heard about it for 2 years, and I'd told myself it wasn't my business." He paused. "Today I decided it was." "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I kept thinking about what it would mean to walk past something like that and do nothing. And I decided I didn't want to be the kind of man who walks past." Clara looked at the warm bed and the folded clothes and the pot of soup. She had spent 24 years waiting for the cost. The hidden clause. The moment when the offered hand turned into something that took rather than gave. She looked at Elias Carter, standing by the door of his cabin in the falling snow, and she understood with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had learned to read people out of absolute necessity that he was exactly what he appeared to be. And she had no idea at all what to do with that. "Thank you," she said at last. The words felt insufficient for what they were trying to carry. "You're welcome, Miss Whitmore," he said. "There's soup on the stove. Sleep when you're ready. Tomorrow's just tomorrow. Nothing you have to figure out tonight." He moved to the smaller bed near the door, pulled off his boots, and lay down with his back to the room, in the uncomplicated way of a man who meant what he said and was finished saying it. Clara sat down on the bed by the fireplace. She put her cloth bag on the floor beside her. She looked at the fire for a long time. Outside, Black Pine Ridge was somewhere behind the storm, buried in snow and distance, and Samuel Briggs was in one of his saloons doing whatever men like Samuel Briggs did when they didn't get what they wanted, which was usually planning how to get it another way. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know what was coming. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was warm and the door was solid, and the man who had brought her here was already asleep and had asked for nothing. She put her head down on a pillow that smelled like pine and cold air and something clean. And Clara Whitmore, the woman the whole town of Black Pine Ridge had decided was worth $5 and a floor to scrub, closed her eyes. And slept. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of an axe. Not the frantic, desperate sound of someone working against a deadline, but the steady, rhythmic sound of someone who had done the same thing every morning for so many years that the motion had become as automatic as breathing. Strike, pause, strike, pause. The sound came through the cabin wall with the particular clarity that cold air gives to noise, and for a moment, just a moment in the space between sleep and waking, Clara didn't know where she was. Then she remembered. She lay still for a few seconds, looking at the ceiling, listening to the axe, and took inventory of herself the way she always did when she woke in an unfamiliar place. Her fever was gone. Her chest felt clearer than it had in weeks. The blankets were heavy and warm and smelled like cedar, and the fire had burned down to coals, but the cabin was still holding the warmth from the night before. She was alive. She was warm. Nobody had touched her in the night. She sat up. The smaller bed by the door was empty and neatly made, which told her that Elias Carter was either a man of precise habits or the kind of person who made his bed automatically the way you do when you've lived alone long enough that small disciplines become the scaffolding that holds the day together. She found her shoes, laced them, and stood up. She crossed to the window and looked out at the gray pre-dawn light and saw him, enormous, unhurried, splitting wood with the axe, like the cold wasn't a factor and the storm from the previous night hadn't happened. He worked without a coat. That detail stopped her for a moment. The temperature outside was brutal. She could feel it radiating through the glass, and this man was out there in his shirt sleeves, splitting firewood like it was a May morning. Clara turned away from the window and looked at the stove. The soup from last night was still there, cold now. She found a pot of water, found the coffee tin. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute most people in hard country made do with, and had the stove going and the coffee heating before she had consciously decided to do any of it. The habit of making herself useful ran deeper than thought. She told herself she was doing it because she wanted coffee, not because some part of her was already calculating how to justify her presence here. She almost believed it. The axe stopped just before the coffee was ready. She heard his boots on the steps. Then the door opened, and Elias came in carrying an armload of split wood, bringing a wave of cold air that made the fire spit. He stopped when he saw her standing at the stove. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it recalibrated slightly. Not surprise, exactly, more like the adjustment a person makes when the world does something they hadn't scheduled. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's almost ready," Clara said. "I hope that's all right." He set the wood down by the hearth and straightened up. "It's more than all right." He looked at her for a moment. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," she said. And it was the truth, and the honesty of it surprised her slightly, because she was usually more careful about giving people accurate information about her vulnerability. Telling someone you'd slept poorly was fine. It was expected, even the kind of complaint that invited sympathy without revealing much. Telling someone you'd slept better than you had in months told them that your months had been bad, and that was real information, the kind that could be used. She handed him the coffee. He took it with both hands and drank without ceremony, and she noticed that he didn't thank her 3 times or make a production of it, which was its own kind of courtesy. He simply received it like a person receiving something offered freely. "I'd like to contribute," Clara said, "to the household, whatever needs doing." "I told you. I know what you told me." She met his eyes directly, which took more effort than she wanted to admit. "And I heard you. But I'm asking as a person who needs to feel useful, not as someone trying to pay down a debt. There's a difference, and I'd like you to respect it." Elias considered this. She could see him actually thinking it through, rather than just responding, which was another thing she wasn't used to, men who paused before speaking as though the words mattered. "Fair enough," he said. "I won't refuse help that's offered freely." "Good." She turned back to the stove. "What do you need done first?" The rhythm of that first week was something Clara could not have predicted and could not afterward have described easily to anyone who hadn't lived it. It was not comfortable in the way that the word comfortable usually gets used. It wasn't soft or easy or without friction. But it was consistent. And for a woman whose life had been defined by instability, consistent felt like a kind of luxury she had not known she was starving for. Elias moved through his days with the same unhurried precision he had shown at the axe that first morning. He did not waste motion. He did not fill silence with words that didn't need to be said. He woke early, worked hard, ate simply, and went to sleep without complaint. And he extended to Clara the same uncomplicated courtesy he seemed to extend to everything in his life: the horse, the tools, the cabin itself. He took care of things. He took care without making a performance of it. Clara cooked. She found she was good at it in the way you get good at something when it's been your primary method of making yourself indispensable since the age of 12. She stretched what he had in the pantry with the specific creativity of someone who had learned to make a meal out of very little, and the first time she put a proper dinner on the table, not soup but a real meal, biscuits and salt pork and roasted potatoes. Elias looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I wanted to. Clara said. That's different. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it retreated. Yes, he said. I reckon it is. She started learning the cabin the way you learn a language, one word at a time out of necessity. Where the extra blankets were kept. Which floorboard near the door was loose and needed to be stepped over. That Elias took his coffee without sugar, but with exactly 1 spoonful of the dried cream he kept in a tin by the window. That he checked the weather by standing outside for 30 seconds every morning and every evening, looking at the sky and the tree line with the serious attention of a man reading a document. She started checking the weather with him without announcing that she was doing it. The third morning, she came outside and stood beside him and looked at the sky, and he glanced at her sideways and said, "Storm's going to hold off another few days." How do you know? Wind's coming from the southeast. When it shifts northwest, that's when you worry. What does worry look like for a storm up here, I mean? He pointed at a ridge to the north where the tree line ended. When those trees start moving and you can't hear them, he said. That's when you get inside and stay inside. Clara looked at the trees. What does that mean? Moving without sound. The wind's blowing so hard the sound itself gets drowned out, he said. Everything moving, nothing audible. That's a storm that'll kill you if you're caught outside. She stored this information with the seriousness it deserved. I'll remember that. See that you do. It wasn't warm, that exchange, but it was real. And she was finding that she preferred real to warm when she had to choose. The fourth night she woke to a sound that wasn't the axe. It was quieter than the axe, and less regular, and it took her a few seconds of lying still and listening before she identified it. Someone moving around the cabin in the dark. She sat up fast, her heart doing the thing it always did when unexpected things happened at night, the sharp animal lurch of a body that has learned to treat the unexpected as a threat. She made herself breathe. She listened. The sound was coming from outside, not inside. And it wasn't a person. It was something larger moving through the snow around the side of the cabin with a shuffling heavy gait. She got up carefully and crossed to Elias's bed by the door and touched his shoulder. He was awake before her hand landed. I heard it, he said. What is it? Black bear, he said, already reaching for his rifle from the rack above the door. Probably a young one that hasn't denned up yet. Confused by the weather. He moved to the door with the ease of a man performing a task he had done before. Stay inside. I wasn't planning to go out. Some people do panic things, he said, which was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him, and it was so unexpected that she almost laughed. He went outside for less than 10 minutes. She heard him move around the cabin's perimeter, heard him talk. Actually, talk, not shout, in a low, steady voice, and heard the bear's noise gradually recede into the trees. He came back in without explanation, put the rifle back on its rack, and looked at her, standing in the middle of the cabin with her blanket around her shoulders. Gone, he said. You talked to it, Clara said. I did. What did you say? He hung up his coat. Told it the winter was hard enough without getting itself shot by a nervous man, and it ought to find somewhere warmer to sleep. Clara looked at him. Do bears generally respond to reasonable arguments? That one did, he said, and this time she was certain he was almost smiling even in the dark. She went back to bed and lay there for a long time after the cabin had gone quiet again, listening to the snow and the wind and the distant trees, and she noticed that the panic that had woken her had completely dissolved. Not slowly the way fear usually left her, but quickly replaced by something steadier. She was trying to identify what it was when she realized. She trusted him. Not completely. Not without reservation. But enough. She trusted Elias Carter enough to sleep in the same cabin, enough to eat the food he provided, enough to go back to sleep after he said gone in that flat, certain voice. She hadn't trusted anyone that quickly in years, maybe ever. She told herself it was practical. That it was simply the intelligent response to available evidence. The man had done nothing to suggest he was dangerous, and several things to suggest he wasn't. Trust was the rational conclusion. She told herself that, and she believed about half of it, and she lay in the dark and listened to the quiet and didn't examine the other half too closely. The seventh day, she found the ledger. She hadn't been snooping. She had been reorganizing the shelf above the fireplace, straightening it actually. Because the way the tins and tools were arranged made her eye twitch every time she looked at it, and the ledger had been behind a stack of old almanacs, and when she pulled it out, thinking it was another almanac, it fell open to a page of numbers that stopped her completely. She looked at it. She looked at it longer. Then she carried it to the table and sat down. The ledger was a record of Elias's finances going back 12 years, written in a hand that was precise and careful, not the hand of a man who had received much formal education, but the hand of a man who had taught himself to keep records and took the discipline seriously. 12 years of income and expenditures tracking everything from fur sales to supply costs, and the picture that emerged from those 12 years of numbers was nothing like what Clara had assumed. Elias Carter was not a comfortable man living simply by preference. He was a man who had been systematically cheated. She could see it in the numbers once she understood the pattern. The prices he received for his pelts had dropped steadily over 6 years, while his supply costs from the Black Pine General Store, the same store that had extended Clara her $42 debt, had risen at a rate that didn't correspond to any reasonable market fluctuation. The markups were too consistent, too precise. They had the specific shape of someone who knew what they were doing and was doing it carefully enough to avoid easy detection. Someone was stealing from Elias Carter in small calculated amounts, year over year, in a way that had cost him. She ran the numbers twice to be sure, nearly $300 over 6 years. She was still sitting at the table with the ledger when Elias came in from checking the horses. He saw her and stopped. He looked at the ledger. A long, very still moment passed. "That was behind the almanacs," Clara said. "I know where it was. Elias." She turned the ledger so he could see the column she had been working through. "Has anyone looked at this recently? Someone who understands accounts." "I understand accounts. I know you do. You've kept careful records for 12 years. She kept her voice even the way she had learned to keep her voice when she had information that mattered and needed the other person to receive it clearly rather than defensively. "But have you looked at the pattern, not the individual numbers, the pattern over time?" He crossed the room slowly and looked at the column she was pointing to. She watched his face. He was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she had misjudged something, if this was information he already had, or information he didn't want, or if she had overstepped in a way she hadn't yet learned the boundaries of. Then he said very quietly, "That's the supply cost column." "Yes." "It shouldn't look like that." "No," Clara said. "It shouldn't." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He looked at the numbers with the particular focus of a person who is rearranging things they thought they understood. She could see him doing it, the recalibration, the way the face changes when something you accepted as the cost of doing business reveals itself to have been theft done slowly enough that you never felt the individual moments of it. "How much?" he asked, though something in his voice said he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Closer to 300 than 250, she said. "Over 6 years. Maybe more. I haven't finished the whole ledger." Elias put both hands flat on the table. Clara waited. "Briggs," he said. It wasn't a question. "The general store carries his name on the supply invoices twice in the last 3 years, she said. "It might not be him directly, but someone with access to that store's pricing, it's him." Elias's voice had gone very flat, the way a river goes flat before a waterfall. "He's been running the supply pricing in that store for 4 years. I knew he was a greedy man. I didn't know he was a careful one." Clara looked at him carefully. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer immediately. He kept looking at the numbers. She could see the anger in him. It was there, real and considerable, but it was contained the way a fire is contained inside a stove. The heat was all there. The shape of it was controlled. "I'm going to think about it," he said finally. "That's wise." He looked up at her. "How do you know accounts?" "My father kept the books for a trading company in Ohio," she said. From the time I was old enough to reach the desk, he taught me. He said. She paused because this was more than she usually offered anyone. He said a woman who could read a ledger would never be entirely without power regardless of what else happened to her. Elias was quiet for a moment. He was right. He was. She closed the ledger carefully. He died when I was 16, and the man who took over the company said female bookkeepers made the clients uncomfortable, so he let me go. She stopped again. I've been finding my way since then. Elias didn't say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. She didn't want anyone's sorrow about it. What had happened, and she had survived it, and was still here. What he said instead was, "You have a real skill." "I know," Clara said, which was not how she usually responded to compliments, because she had learned that women who agreed with compliments were considered arrogant, and women who deflected were considered appropriately modest, and she was tired of choosing between those options. "I've always known." Something shifted in Elias's expression. Not dramatically, there was nothing dramatic about this man, but unmistakably, like something settling into a more accurate position. "I could use someone who can read a ledger," he said. "Not to pay off any debt," he added immediately. He seemed to search for the word which suggested it was not a word he used often. "As a partner, in the business side of things." Clara looked at him across the table. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had begun to shift. "Let me finish going through the whole ledger first," she said. "Then we'll talk about what we find." He nodded once, which she was beginning to recognize as his version of agreed. She pulled the ledger back toward her and turned to the next page. Elias got up, put more wood on the fire, and sat down beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. He didn't comment on the numbers she pointed to. He didn't explain things she already understood. He simply sat there while she worked occasionally, reaching over to hold the page flat when the binding wanted to fold it closed, and the gesture was so quietly collaborative that Clara had to focus very deliberately on the columns of numbers to keep her concentration where it belonged. She worked for 2 hours. What she found was worse than the first page had suggested. The supply markups were only part of it. There were also discrepancies in the fur pricing, not enough to be obvious in any individual transaction, but consistent over time, in a way that was undeniable once you laid 3 years of records side by side. Someone in Black Pine Ridge had been systematically shorting Elias Carter on the price paid per pelt, recording a market rate in the official ledger that was a reliable 8% below what the fur buyers in Billings were actually paying during those same periods. She knew this because she had seen the Billings fur market reports. Her father's company had dealt in furs, and she had grown up reading those reports, and the numbers in her memory were accurate enough to tell her that what Elias had been receiving did not match what he should have been receiving. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. 8%, he said, consistently, for at least 3 years. Possibly longer. I'd need the earlier records to be certain. I don't have the earlier records, he said. I burned them. He paused. I burned them 6 years ago when I wanted to put the first years behind me and start clean. Clara absorbed this. Then we can only prove what's in this ledger. That's enough. His voice had that flat river quality again, more pronounced now. It's more than enough. Elias. She turned to face him. He was looking at the ledger, and his jaw was set, and she could see what was building in him, and she thought it was important to say the next thing carefully. Whatever you're thinking about doing, make sure it can be documented. Make sure there's a record. Men like Briggs are counting on men like you to respond with anger rather than evidence. Anger goes away. Evidence stays. He looked at her. Your father taught you that too? He asked. No, she said. That one I learned myself, the hard way. She said it without elaboration, and he received it without asking for more. And that was another thing she was learning about Elias Carter. He understood that some information was offered, and some was protected, and he did not push against the boundaries of what was protected. She was starting to understand why he lived alone. Not because he didn't know how to be around people, But because he had very high standards for the quality of human company, and most people didn't meet them, and he had decided that solitude was preferable to compromise. She was starting to wonder with a caution she held very quietly, and didn't examine too directly whether she might be the kind of company he hadn't known he was waiting for. 3 days later, a rider came up the mountain. Clara was inside when she heard the horse, and she crossed to the window and looked out and saw a boy. 14, maybe 15, riding hard enough up the trail that it was clear he'd been sent with urgency. Elias was already at the door by the time she looked away from the window. "You know him?" she asked. "Thomas Greeley. Runs errands for the telegraph office." He was already pulling on his coat. The boy's name was Tom, and he was breathing hard when he reached the cabin porch, and he handed Elias a folded piece of paper, with the manner of someone delivering something they know is bad news, but whose specific content they don't know. Elias read it. His face did nothing. Then he folded it and held it at his side and said, "Thank you, Tom. Go inside and warm up before you ride back. Miss Whitmore will get you something hot." Tom came inside, and Clara gave him coffee and a biscuit left from breakfast, and she did not ask about the telegram, because asking before Elias chose to tell her was the kind of thing she had decided without quite deciding it not to do. Tom rode back down the mountain 20 minutes later. Elias came inside. He stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, and Clara saw something cross his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not quite worry, heavier than worry. "My brother-in-law," he said, "has filed a claim on this land." Clara turned to face him fully. "Your brother-in-law?" "My wife's brother, Hector Mace." The name came out of his mouth like something he didn't enjoy the taste of. "My wife passed 4 years ago. We had no children. There was no will, we never got around to it, and then there was no time." He stopped. "The claim says that because she was joint owner of this land in common law, and she died intestate, her half-interest transfers to her nearest male relative." "Which would be him," Clara said. "Which would be him." He sat down. "He's been waiting 4 years. I thought he'd given up." "What changed?" Elias looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, and she realized with a slow, cold certainty what the answer was before he said it. "You," he said. "He heard about you, about what I paid at the auction." He paused. "Briggs will have sent word. Those two have been friends since before I ever came to this territory. Briggs hears I spent serious money at an auction, he tells Mace, and Mace decides that means I have resources worth claiming." Clara sat down across from him. The fire crackled. She looked at the closed ledger on the table between them. "So," she said very carefully, "the man who has been stealing from you for 6 years just told his associate about your finances, and now that associate is trying to claim your land. That's about the size of it. And the legal claim, is it valid?" Elias rubbed his jaw. "It might be, depending on who you ask and how they interpret common law inheritance in the territory. But it might not be. Also, depending on who you ask." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there a land registry in Black Pine Ridge?" "In the county seat, Millhaven, 3 hours south." "And the records of how you acquired this land, original purchase, any documentation of sole ownership before your marriage?" "I filed the original claim myself," Elias said, 19 years ago, before I ever met Cora." He looked at her steadily. "Clara, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, pulling the ledger toward her and opening it to the back pages where he'd kept notes rather than numbers, "that a fraudulent supply scheme and a spurious land claim both require the same thing to collapse." "What's that?" She looked at him directly. "Documentation that someone who knows how to read it goes through in a courthouse publicly where everyone in the territory can see what's in it." Elias was very still. "That's a significant thing to take on," he said. "I know. It would mean going back to Black Pine Ridge, into Briggs's territory." "I know that too." "They laughed at you on that platform," he said. "A week ago. You walked away from that town. You don't have to walk back into it." Clara looked at him across the table. She thought about the auction platform and the frozen mud, and Samuel Briggs calling her not worth the firewood. She thought about $42 of debt and a cloth bag with a broken comb in it. She thought about every moment in her life when she had been small and careful and quiet, and it had not protected her from anything. Because smallness and carefulness and quiet were not actually protection, they were just a way of making yourself easier to overlook. "Mr. Mace files his claim publicly," she said. "He'd have to. Then when he files it," Clara said, "I want to be in that courthouse, with this ledger, and anything else we can document between now and then." She closed the ledger firmly. "Briggs wants to make a move against you, using your resources as evidence of wealth. I want to make a counter move using his ledger entries as evidence of theft. We need a lawyer, and we need the original land records, and we need to move before Mace's filing gets confirmed." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" The question landed simply without challenge or suspicion, but it was real, and it deserved a real answer, and she gave it one. "Because you walked up to an auction platform and took your hat off," she said. "And nobody in that crowd understood what that meant. But I did." She paused. "I've been looking for a reason to do something that mattered. You might be it." Outside, the wind shifted. Both of them heard it. Elias stood up and went to the door and opened it, and Clara came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the ridge to the north where the trees were moving. "Southeast to northwest," she said. "Yes," he said. "Storm's coming." "Yes." He looked at her sideways. "But not today." He closed the door, and in the quiet of the cabin, with the ledger on the table between them, and a storm building over the ridge, and two men in Black Pine Ridge, who had decided that Elias Carter's resources were theirs, to take the mountain man and the woman nobody wanted, sat back down together and started planning how to take everything back. The storm hit 2 days before they were ready. Clara had been copying figures from the ledger onto separate sheets of paper, clean copies organized by category, the kind of documentation that a lawyer could present without having to explain the mess of 12 years of self-kept records. She had developed a system supply discrepancies on one set of pages, fur pricing gaps on another, and a third set that cross-referenced the dates of Briggs's involvement in the general store against the precise moments when Elias's costs had begun to climb. The pattern was damning. The more she organized it, the more damning it became. Elias had ridden down to Millhaven the day before to speak with a man named Aldous Webb, the only attorney in the county who, according to Elias, was neither in Briggs's pocket nor stupid enough to pick a fight he couldn't win. He had come back after dark with the news that Webb was willing to look at the ledger and that Mace's claim had been filed 3 days prior, which meant they had less time than they'd hoped, and the clock was now a real and specific pressure rather than an abstract concern. He had also come back with the information that Briggs knew about the ledger. Clara had looked up from her copying when Elias said that, and she had gone very still, and she had asked how. "Webb told me," Elias said. "Briggs came to see him last week, before I did. He told Webb that he'd heard I had a woman up here going through my private financial records, and that he intended to contest any claims made against his business practices on the grounds that the records were compiled by a person with no legal standing and a personal interest in damaging his reputation." He paused. "He used your name." "He doesn't know my name." "He does now. Horace Dunn gave it to him." His jaw was tight. "Horace keeps records of every placement he runs. He gave Briggs your full name, your debt history, your family background, everything in his file." Clara set down her pen. She thought about Horace Dunn standing on the auction platform, announcing her debts to a laughing crowd, and she thought about that same man handing a file with her name on it to Samuel Briggs. And she felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but had elements of both a cold, clarifying feeling, like plunging your hands into ice water. "He said a person with no legal standing," she said. "He did. Meaning a woman's accounting isn't admissible. Webb says it's complicated." Elias sat down across from her. "Territory law on this is not clear. In some jurisdictions, a woman's sworn testimony is accepted in civil proceedings. In others, it requires a male corroborating witness. So we need someone else to verify the numbers. We need someone else to verify the numbers." Clara looked at her stacked pages of documentation. 3 days of work, every figure double-checked, every pattern laid out in language that even a hostile reader couldn't reasonably misinterpret. She had been proud of it. She was still proud of it. But pride wasn't the same as admissible. "Is there anyone in Millhaven who could look at this independently?" she asked. "An accountant, a banker, someone whose standing Briggs can't challenge." "There's a man named Perrin at the Millhaven Savings and Land Trust," Elias said. "He's the chief accounts examiner. I don't know him personally." "Could Webb approach him?" "Possibly." "Then that's what we need to do." She picked up her pen again. "I'll finish these copies tonight. You take them to Webb tomorrow and ask him to get Perrin to look at them. If Perrin confirms the discrepancies independently, his testimony stands on its own, and mine becomes supporting evidence rather than the foundation." Elias watched her for a moment. "You're not angry," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm furious," she said without looking up from the page. "I'm simply more interested in winning than in showing it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." She kept writing. The storm came that night. Not the gradual building she had been watching on the ridge. This one came fast, the way the worst ones do, with the specific cruelty of weather that has decided not to give you time to prepare. She woke to a sound she had never heard before, a low, continuous roar that she felt in her chest before she understood it was wind. And when she crossed to the window, the world outside was completely white, not snowing, but blowing horizontal and total. Elias was already up. He was at the door, pulling on his heaviest coat, moving with the focused speed of a man who had survived mountain winters before and knew exactly how serious this was. "The horses," he said. "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. She could see him calculating what she was capable of, what the risk was, what the alternatives were. "Stay inside," he said. "Keep the fire going. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, don't come out looking for me. The horses and I will find our way. You going out in this helps no one." 30 minutes, she said. "If I'm not back in 30 minutes, it means I'm waiting out the worst of it in the stable." He held her gaze. "I am not lost. I am not in trouble. I am simply waiting. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Say it back to me." She looked at him. "You are not lost. You are not in trouble. You are waiting. I will not come outside." He nodded once and went out the door, and the wind came in like a living thing for the 2 seconds before he got it closed, and then Clara was alone with the fire and the roaring sound and the 30-minute clock that she was already counting in her head. She put more wood on the fire. She checked the stove. She crossed to the table and looked at her stacked pages of documentation and thought about Briggs's move, the preemptive visit to Webb, the deliberate use of her lack of legal standing, the file Horace Dunn had handed over. It was a sophisticated play for a man who presented himself as a simple saloon owner. That sophistication told her something important: Briggs was not reacting to them. He had been preparing for something like this for a while. He had anticipated that his supply scheme might eventually come to light, and he had laid groundwork in advance to discredit whoever brought it forward. The question was whether he had anticipated that whoever brought it forward would have already thought about that. She picked up her pen and started writing a fourth document. Not accounting figures this time, a timeline. Every interaction she had witnessed or heard described between Briggs and anyone connected to Elias's business, organized chronologically, with every piece of supporting evidence noted. The kind of document that showed not just what had happened, but the deliberate, sustained pattern of intent behind it. Intent was what separated fraud from error. Intent was what made it prosecutable rather than merely embarrassing. She wrote for 25 minutes without looking up. The door opened, and Elias came in on a blast of cold air, his beard white with ice, his coat stiff, and she looked up from the page and registered in the same moment that he was safe, and that he had been gone 28 minutes, and that her body had been counting those minutes with the specific alertness of someone who has promised not to do something and is very much feeling the pressure of that promise. "Horses are fine," he said, working the ice out of his beard with one hand. "Settled in the stable with extra hay. They've been through worse." Good, she said, and went back to writing. He stood there for a moment. Clara. You're still working. I had an idea. She turned the page toward him without stopping. Look at this. This is a timeline of every documented point of contact between Briggs and your supply chain. Look at the dates. He crossed the room dripping meltwater and looked at the timeline. He read it slowly. Then he looked at her. He started the markup the same month he bought into the general store, Elias said. Within 2 weeks of taking his ownership stake, Clara said. That's not opportunism. That's planning. He bought into the store because it gave him access to your supply account, and he started extracting money immediately. She tapped the page. That's premeditated fraud, and it's documented. Elias straightened up. Something had changed in his expression. Not anger, though the anger was still there underneath everything. Something that looked, if she had to name it, like the particular quality of respect that comes when someone surprises you with a capability you had underestimated. Aldous Webb needs to see this tonight, he said. The storm. Tomorrow then. First thing. He pulled off his coat and hung it up and looked at her with that settling, recalibrating expression. Clara, what you've put together here, it's not just ledger figures. It's a case. That's what I was trying to build, she said. Most people couldn't have done this. I know. She looked at him steadily. My father used to say that numbers don't lie, but they do hide. You have to know where to look. She paused. I know where to look. Elias sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the storm roared outside, and the fire crackled, and the cabin held its warmth against everything the mountain was doing to take it away. Tell me about the timeline, he said. All of it. Walk me through every point. So she did. She talked, and he listened. Really listened the way he did everything with his full attention, and without interruption, and as she walked him through the documented pattern of Briggs's fraud, she watched understanding settle on his face, like snow settling on a surface, quiet and accumulating, and by the end, substantial. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He's going to know we're coming, Elias said. Whatever move we make in Millhaven, Briggs will hear about it before we're done making it. He has people in that county seat. I know. Which means he'll have time to prepare a counter. He's already prepared a counter, she said. The legal standing argument. The pre-visit to Webb. He's been preparing counters. That's who he is. She folded her hands on the table. But there's something he didn't prepare for. What's that? Me, she said simply. He prepared for an angry mountain man with a grievance and a ledger. He prepared for someone he could dismiss as emotional, unsophisticated, and legally powerless. She looked at Elias directly. He didn't prepare for someone who has read his entire business history, documented his pattern of intent, and can walk into that courthouse and explain it so clearly that even a hostile audience understands it. Elias looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. He didn't prepare for that. The storm kept them inside for 2 full days. The first day was functional. They worked, organized the documentation, further identified the specific legal arguments that Webb would need to make, and ate meals that Clara cooked with the focused energy of someone who needs to do something with her hands while her mind works through problems. The second day was different. By the second day, there was nothing left to organize, and the storm showed no signs of relenting, and they were 2 people in a small cabin with no work left to do and nowhere to go, and that changed the texture of the time between them in ways that neither of them named. Elias taught her to play chess. He produced a board from a chest under his bed. Hand-made the pieces carved from pine and dark wood, worn smooth from years of use, and he set it up on the table and said that a woman who could read a ledger would have no trouble understanding chess, which was simply pattern recognition in 3 dimensions. Clara beat him in their third game. Not because she was a natural chess player. She made several obvious mistakes in the middle of the game that a more experienced opponent would have punished, but because Elias at a critical moment made a decision based on what he expected her to do rather than what she actually did, and she recognized the moment when it happened, and moved in the opposite direction from his expectation and won. He stared at the board for a moment after she took his king. "You saw that coming," he said. "I saw that you expected me to protect my queen," she said. "So I didn't. Most people would have protected the queen. I'm not most people." He looked at her across the board, and something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but the warm infrastructure that a smile would need the thing underneath it. "No," he said. "You're not." They played 3 more games after that, and he won 2 of them, and she won 1. And by the end of the evening, they were arguing cheerfully about whether her second win had been genuine strategy or a mistake that accidentally produced a winning position. And she was maintaining firmly and with increasing laughter in her voice that intention was irrelevant and result was everything. "That is not how chess is supposed to work," Elias said. "I disagree," Clara said. "I think result is the whole point. Intent matters. In chess or in life?" He paused. "Both." She looked at him. "Then let me ask you something. That first day at the auction when you walked up to the table and put down that pouch of gold, what was your intent?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm had softened slightly, still going, but losing its roar, becoming something that could be waited out rather than survived. "To get you off that platform," he said. "That's the result. That's what happened. I'm asking about the intent. What were you actually trying to do?" He looked at the chessboard for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I don't entirely know," he said. And she could tell from the quality of his honesty that this was the actual truth, not a deflection. "I know I couldn't walk away. I know it felt like watching something that shouldn't be allowed to happen. And I had the means to stop it, and not stopping it when you have the means is a choice. A bad one." He paused. "I think the intent was I wanted to give you room. To breathe. To figure out what you needed, without someone owning that process." Clara was quiet. "You succeeded," she said finally. "Did I?" "I'm breathing," she said. "I'm figuring things out." She gestured at the stacked documentation on the table. "I feel more like myself than I have in years." Elias looked at the papers, then back at her. "Good," he said very quietly. She looked away first. She looked away, first because something in the steadiness of his gaze was doing something to her composure that she was not ready to examine in a small cabin during a snowstorm. And she was a woman who had survived a great deal by being honest with herself about timing, and this was not the time. But she filed the moment away with precision. The storm broke the following morning, and they rode to Millhaven the next day. Aldous Webb was a thin, energetic man of about 50, who wore his intelligence visibly like a tool he was always about to use. He read Clara's documentation in 45 minutes without saying anything, and then he read it again in 30, and then he set it down on his desk and looked at Clara with the specific expression of someone who has just received better ammunition than they expected. "This is meticulous," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. "I mean that as a professional assessment, not a courtesy." He tapped the timeline document. "This pattern of intent argument is strong. If Perrin at the Land Trust will corroborate the figures independently, Briggs's legal standing attack on the ledger becomes moot because the foundation of the case no longer rests on your testimony alone." "That's what I calculated," Clara said. Webb looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression. The recalibration she was starting to recognize in men who had underestimated her and were updating. "Where did you train?" "I didn't," she said. "My father taught me." "He taught you well." He would have liked to hear that. She folded her hands in her lap. "What do we do first?" Webb leaned back. "First, I go to Perrin, today if possible. Second, we file a counter-response to Mace's land claim, asserting prior sole ownership on the basis of Elias's original territorial claim predating the marriage. Third," he paused. "Third is the harder part." "The fraud claim against Briggs," Elias said. "Yes." Webb looked between them. "Filing that publicly opens both of you to scrutiny as well as Briggs. He will retaliate. He will use every resource he has to discredit this documentation and the people who compiled it. And he has resources. I know, Clara said. Miss Whitmore. Webb looked at her directly. He has already attempted to discredit you personally. I told Carter when he came to see me that Briggs had characterized you as his exact words were a destitute woman with a personal vendetta who was manipulating a lonely man for financial gain. The words landed with the weight they were designed to carry. Clara felt them. She let herself feel them for exactly 3 seconds, and then she set them aside. His characterization of me is incorrect, she said in the same tone she would have used to note that a column of figures didn't add up. The documentation stands independent of my character. If Perrin verifies it, Briggs's characterization becomes irrelevant. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. I'm going to see Perrin now, he said. Come back at 2 o'clock. He picked up the documentation. May I keep these copies? They're yours, Clara said. I have the originals. He nodded and reached for his coat, and then he stopped and looked back at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. Forgive me for asking something personal, he said. Ask, she said. Are you all right? Not the documentation, not the case. You. He glanced briefly at Elias and back. Briggs has put a target on you. He did it before you even knew what you were walking into. That's a heavy thing to carry, and I want to make sure you understand the weight of it before we proceed. Clara looked at him. She thought about the auction platform, and the frozen mud, and the cloth bag with the broken comb. She thought about her father's ledgers, and the company that had told her women made clients uncomfortable. She thought about $42 of debt, and Horace Dunn handing her file to Samuel Briggs, and Briggs calling her a destitute woman with a personal vendetta. She thought about Elias standing at the hitching post with an extra blanket in the saddlebag and chess pieces carved from pine, and a man who took off his hat. I am carrying it fine, she said. Thank you for asking. They came back at 2 o'clock. Perrin had looked at the figures. Perrin had verified the discrepancies. Perrin had, according to Webb, with the controlled excitement of a man who rarely let controlled excitement show, described the supply markup pattern as one of the most clearly documented cases of deliberate pricing fraud he had seen in 20 years of accounts examination. Elias sat very still when Webb said this. Clara put both hands flat on the desk and breathed. He'll testify, Elias said. He will, Webb said. He's actually, and I say this with some professional admiration, angry. Perrin is not a man who gets angry easily, but systematic fraud in the territorial supply chain is something he takes personally. He looked between them. We can file by end of this week. The hearing on Mace's land claim is scheduled for 2 weeks from Thursday. I want to file the fraud counter on the same day and request that the judge consolidate the hearings. Can he do that? Clara asked. He can. And he should, because the two cases are substantively connected. Mace's claim is designed to strip Elias of the land so that Briggs can step in and acquire it through Mace at below market value. I can make that argument, and I believe it holds. He paused. But if I make that argument, I need something more. I need documentation of a connection between Briggs and Mace that predates the land claim filing. Clara turned to Elias. Elias looked at her. The supply invoices, she said. What? The last 3 years of supply invoices, the ones with Briggs's name on them. 2 of them also have a forwarding address for the payment confirmations. I noticed it and I thought it was odd, and I wrote it down. She opened her bag and pulled out the small notebook she had been using for reference notes and turned to the page. The confirmations were being forwarded to a property management office in Billings. She turned the notebook toward Webb. Is that address familiar? Webb looked at it. His expression shifted. That, he said slowly, is the address of a property management company that I happen to know is registered in the name of one Hector Mace. Nobody spoke for a moment. Outside somewhere in Millhaven, life was going on the way it always did. Horses commerce, the ordinary business of a territorial county seat. Inside Webb's office, it was very quiet. They've been splitting the proceeds. Elias said. His voice was flat and very controlled. Briggs takes it out of my supply account, routes the confirmation to Mace's property company. They split it. That would be my reading of it, Webb said. It's been going on for 6 years, Elias said. Closer to 7 if we follow the forwarding address back to its establishment date, Webb said carefully. Before Cora died, Elias said. And something in those 3 words, the flatness of them, the specific weight, told Clara something she hadn't known before. That this wasn't just about money and land. That Hector Mace had not simply been a grieving brother who waited 4 years before making a move on his dead sister's property. That the waiting had been strategic. That perhaps the timeline of the fraud and the timeline of other things were not as separate as they appeared. She looked at Elias. He was looking at the desk. His jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle working. "Elias," she said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him do something internal, take something large and furious, and grief-complicated, and put it somewhere it wouldn't interfere with what needed to happen next. The way you do when you've spent a lifetime in places where falling apart wasn't an option. "File everything," he said to Webb. "File it all. End of this week." "I will," Webb said. Elias stood up. He walked out of Webb's office without another word, and Clara followed him into the cold Millhaven street, and she didn't try to talk to him because she understood that there was a specific kind of pain that needed air and distance before it could accept company. She walked beside him. Not ahead, not behind. Beside. They walked for 3 blocks in silence before he stopped. He was looking at a hardware store window. She didn't think he was seeing the hardware. She was sick, he said. Cora. For a long time before she died. 2 years. I spent those 2 years managing the cabin alone, making the supply runs, trying to keep things going while she was... He stopped. Mace came to visit twice during those 2 years. I was grateful. I thought he came because she was his sister, and he loved her. The muscle in his jaw moved. He came because he was establishing a timeline, familiarizing himself with the land, assessing the asset. Clara was very still. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it in the way that you mean something when there are no words adequate to it, and you know it and you say it anyway, because not saying it is worse. "He sat at my table," Elias said. "He ate my food. He held her hand when she was..." He stopped again. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned away from the hardware store window and looked at Clara, and his eyes were very dark and very steady, and held something in them that she recognized because she had held the same thing in herself, the specific dignity of a person who has been genuinely wronged and is refusing to be destroyed by it. "Let's go back," he said. "There's work to finish." They walked back to the horses, and as they rode north toward the mountain, the sun going down behind the peaks and the cold settling hard for the evening. Clara understood something she had not allowed herself to understand clearly before. This was her fight too. Not because she owed Elias anything. Not because she needed to justify her presence in his cabin, or prove her usefulness or pay back a debt that he had already told her didn't exist. But because Samuel Briggs had used her name in Webb's office as a weapon. Because Horace Dunn had handed her file to the man as though her history was a resource to be mined. Because Hector Mace had sat at Elias's table while his dying sister held his hand and calculated the value of the floor beneath her feet. Because these men had looked at 2 people who had been reduced to their least powerful moments, an auction platform, a lonely mountain, a dead woman's property, and decided that reduction was permanent. Clara Whitmore had been told her whole life that she was reducible to her worst circumstances. She was beginning to understand with a clarity that felt like something long overdue that she was not. She rode north into the dark. And she was not afraid. They rode back to the cabin in the kind of silence that isn't empty but full packed tight with everything that had happened in Webb's office and everything that hadn't been said on the street outside the hardware store. Clara didn't try to fill it. She had learned in the weeks since she'd come to this mountain that Elias Carter's silences were not invitations to speak. They were the sound of a man thinking, and interrupting that process helped no one. She thought her own thoughts instead. By the time they reached the cabin and got the horses settled and came inside out of the dark and the cold, Clara had made 3 decisions. First, she needed to go back through the ledger one more time with the Mace property address as a search parameter. She wanted to know if any other payment confirmations had been routed through billings, and she wanted to know how far back it went. Second, she needed to write up everything she had heard in Webb's office in clean, organized language before the details began to blur, because details blurred faster than people expected, when they were also carrying emotional weight. Third, she needed to sleep because the ride and the meeting and the weight of what they had learned had landed on her all at once, and a tired mind made errors, and she could not afford errors. She did the first 2 things, and then lay down, and was asleep before she could begin the third. She woke to Elias making coffee, and the ledger open on the table where she had left it, and she knew immediately from the way he was standing not at the stove, but beside the table, one hand resting on the open page, that he had been up before her and had been reading it. "You found something else," she said. He looked up. "Good morning. You found something else," she said again, because the way his hand was resting on the page was the hand of someone who has found something and is deciding how to present it. He turned the ledger toward her. She crossed the room and looked at the page. He had it open to an older section 4 years back from the period she had not yet fully analyzed. He had marked 2 entries with a small pencil line. Payment confirmations. Both routed to the billings address. Both dated 6 months before Cora died. Clara looked at the dates carefully. She looked at the amounts. She looked at the column headings. Then she looked at Elias. "These aren't supply payments," she said. "No," he said. "They're not." She looked again. The column heading read Medical Supply and Care Provision, which was how Elias had categorized the costs of Cora's illness during her last year. The doctor's visits, the medicines, the things he'd ordered from Millhaven, and paid for through the general store account, because it was the most convenient payment mechanism he had. The amounts were correct for what he had described substantial, the kind of money a serious illness cost. But the payment confirmations were going to Mace's property company in Billings. "Elias," she said slowly, "did you ever receive receipts from the doctor? From the medical suppliers?" "I received what Horace sent over from the store," he said. His voice was very flat. "I assumed the store was passing them through. But the confirmations were going to Billings, which means someone was intercepting the medical payments," he said, "before they reached the suppliers, before they reached the doctor." He stopped. He put both hands flat on the table. "Which means the doctor may not have been paid. The medicine suppliers may not have been paid. Which means—" He stopped again. Clara understood. She understood what he wasn't saying because it was too large and too terrible to say directly, that if the medical payments had been intercepted, if the doctor and the suppliers had not received what Elias had paid and believed was being paid, then the quality of care Cora had received in her last months might have been compromised in ways that Elias had never known and had no way until this moment to know. She put her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. She just put her hand there on the solid muscle of his forearm and felt him go very still under her touch. He stood like that for 30 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "I need to know if the doctor was paid." "We'll find out," Clara said. "Webb can subpoena the payment records. If the doctor's account shows non-payment for services rendered to Cora Carter during that period, it creates a direct link between Mace's property company and the diversion of funds intended for her care." She paused. "It also changes the nature of the fraud charge significantly." "How significantly?" "Diverting business supply payments is fraud," she said. "Diverting medical care payments from a dying woman is something considerably worse." The word she didn't say sat in the room between them. Elias's jaw worked. "Write it down," he said. "Everything. Tonight. I want Webb to have it by day after tomorrow. I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning." He looked at her, then really looked at her the way he sometimes did when he wasn't calculating or deciding, but simply seeing. Clara. Yes. I don't know how to... He stopped, started again. What you're doing here, what you've found. I want you to know that I understand it's more than... Another stop. The articulation was hard for him. She could see that, not because the feeling wasn't there, but because it was large, and he was a man who had lived alone with large feelings for a long time and had gotten out of the habit of making them into words. You don't have to say it, she said. I want to. She waited. I have been alone on this mountain for a long time, he said. I told myself I preferred it that way. I told myself that after Cora, after everything, that solitude was the right thing. The safe thing. He looked at the ledger and then at her. I was wrong. Or I was right for a while, and then it stopped being right, and I didn't notice because there was no one here to notice it with. Clara didn't move. You notice things I stopped seeing, he said. Not just in the ledger. In the everyday. He paused. The way the coffee smells in the morning. The way the chess pieces feel in your hand before you move them. The way a meal eaten with another person is a different thing entirely from a meal eaten alone. He looked at her directly. I had forgotten that. You reminded me. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something she did not entirely have language for, a kind of expanding like a room that has been kept small by closed doors and is now with some caution being asked to find out how large it actually is. Elias, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He held her gaze. I know, he said. That's yes. He straightened up and picked up his coffee cup, which was a man returning to the practical world from a place he had needed to visit briefly. Thank you. You're welcome, she said. Now let me work on this documentation before I lose the details. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. She sat down and picked up her pen and began to write, and he put more wood on the fire, and outside the Montana. Winter was still doing its brutal work, but inside the cabin something had shifted in a way that was quiet and real, and she thought probably permanent. She was still writing when the rider came. She heard the horse before Elias did. She was closer to the window, and she looked up and said, Someone's coming. And Elias was at the door before the horse reached the yard. She came to stand just behind him in the doorway and looked at the rider, who was not Tom Greeley from the telegraph office this time. This was a man she didn't recognize. Older, with a territorial marshal's badge on his coat that caught the weak winter light. Elias Carter, the man said from the saddle. That's right, Elias said. Marshal Dud Haynes out of Millhaven. I have a document I need to serve. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. You can come get it, or I can leave it at your door, but it needs to be received today. Elias walked out and took the paper and opened it, and Clara watched his face as he read, and she had gotten good enough at reading his face to know immediately that whatever was in the document was bad. Not the bad of confirmation, not the bad of expected things arriving, the bad of something unexpected. What is it? She asked when he came back inside. He handed it to her. She read it. She read it twice. It was an emergency injunction filed by Samuel Briggs through a Millhaven attorney she didn't recognize, claiming that Elias Carter had come into possession of proprietary business records belonging to the Black Pine General Store through unlawful means, that the ledger currently in Carter's possession was the property of the store and had been removed without authorization, and that all use of said records in any legal proceeding should be stayed pending a hearing on their provenance. Clara looked at the paper in her hands. Then she looked at Elias. He's claiming the ledger is his, she said. He's claiming I stole it from the store. You kept this ledger yourself. 12 years. Your handwriting is on every page. I know that. Elias's voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. He knows it too. This isn't about winning the argument. It's about slowing us down. If this injunction holds until after Mace's hearing, the hearing on the land claim proceeds without the ledger as evidence. Clara finished. Yes. And without the ledger, Webb has a weaker case. Clara set the paper down on the table. She looked at it. She thought about Briggs and Webb's office preemptive and prepared laying groundwork before they had made a single move. She thought about the legal standing argument, the characterization of her as a woman with a personal vendetta. She thought about the fact that this man had been planning moves against Elias Carter for years and had developed a practiced fluency in anticipation. He was good at this. He was very good at this. But he had made one error. The injunction claims the ledger was removed from the store without authorization, she said. That's what it says. Does the store have a copy of this ledger? Elias looked at her. What? If the ledger is the store's property, the store should have a corresponding copy. Business records kept in duplicate. It's standard practice any reputable attorney will know to ask. She picked up the injunction again and read the specific language. The claim says proprietary business records belonging to the Black Pine General Store. But the ledger records your transactions, your supply costs, your fur prices. It's your record of what you paid and what you received, kept by you in your handwriting. The store's copy of those transactions would be the store's own accounts, a different document. Elias was very still. Webb needs to argue that the ledger is a personal financial record, not a business record, she said. The distinction matters legally. A personal financial record belongs to the individual who kept it. A business record might be jointly owned or belong to the business entity. But Elias, you kept this ledger for yourself, to track your own income and expenses. The fact that it records transactions with the store doesn't make it the store's property any more than a diary that mentions a conversation belongs to the person you were talking to. Whoa. The room was quiet. Outside, Marshall Haynes was still in the yard, apparently waiting to confirm receipt. I need to get to Millhaven today, Elias said. We both do, Clara said. I need to come. Webb needs to hear the personal record argument from me directly, because I can explain the accounting logic in terms that will hold up to scrutiny. And there's something else. What? She was already moving, picking up the documentation she had organized the timeline, the cross-references. The injunction was filed today. Briggs knows we went to see Webb yesterday, which means he had someone watching Webb's office, or he had someone in Webb's confidence who told him. She paused. Elias. Someone told Briggs we had the ledger. Someone told him before he could have known from the injunction timing. Elias went very still. Who knew we had it? Clara said. Who did you speak to between the auction and now outside of this cabin and Webb's office? He thought. Tom Greeley. The boy who brought the telegram. He's 14, and he doesn't know what a ledger is. The stable hand in Millhaven, where I left the horse when I went to see Webb the first time. Possible but unlikely he wouldn't have known what was in the saddlebag. Horace Dunn. Elias said slowly. I stopped at the telegraph office to send a message to a trapper in the North Range about a supply of pelts. Horace operates the telegraph. Clara looked at him. He heard you mention the ledger, she said. I didn't mention the ledger, but I mentioned... He stopped. I mentioned that I'd found irregularities in my accounts. I mentioned it to explain why I needed the message to the trapper sent urgently. I needed him to confirm the pelt prices he'd received from the Billings buyers the last 3 years. And Horace Dunn, Clara said, gave Briggs her file. The pronoun landed between them. Horace Dunn, who kept records of every placement, who had handed Clara's history to Briggs without hesitation, who operated the only telegraph in Black Pine Ridge and knew everything that moved through it. He's Briggs's instrument, Elias said. It was not angry. It was simply the sound of a man recognizing a fact that had been present all along. We need to go, Clara said. She was already putting on her coat. They reached Millhaven in 2 hours. Riding faster than comfort and slower than recklessness, which was how you rode when the stakes were real. Webb was in his office when they arrived, and he read the injunction with the focused speed of a man who had seen this kind of maneuver before and was already categorizing it. Delaying tactic, he said. Briggs knows we have something solid. He's buying time. How do we defeat it? Elias said. The personal record argument, Clara said before Webb could answer. The ledger is Elias's personal financial record, not a store business document. The legal distinction is established in common law and in territorial statute. Webb finished looking at her with that recalibrating expression she was getting used to. Yes, you're right. And if we can get affidavits from 2 independent accounting professionals confirming the nature of the document. He was already reaching for paper. Perrin will give us one. I need a second. The fur buyers in Billings, Clara said. Do any of them keep accounts examiners on staff? Patterson's Fur Trading Company does, Webb said, writing. Their chief examiner is a man named Gerard. I've appeared in the same proceedings with him twice. He's thorough, and he's honest. Can you reach him by telegraph today? I can try. Try, Elias said. Webb wrote the telegraph message in 10 minutes and sent his clerk to the Millhaven Telegraph Office, not Horace Dunn's office in Black Pine Ridge. The Millhaven office, which was outside Briggs's network, and then he leaned back in his chair and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who is thinking several moves ahead. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Before we go any further. Clara looked at him. I made some inquiries this morning, Webb said. After Carter left my office yesterday, I started looking into Briggs's other business interests, not just the store and the saloons. He paused. He has a third interest that isn't publicly documented, a land speculation partnership operating under a holding company name that has acquired 6 properties in the last 4 years in situations where the original owners faced sudden legal or financial pressure. The room was very quiet. 6 properties, Elias said. 6. In each case, the owner faced either a legal challenge, a debt claim, or a combination of both that required immediate resources to defend. In 3 of the 6 cases, the owner was unable to mount a defense and sold at below market value. The holding company acquired the property. Within 18 months, each of those properties had been sold again at full market value or above. And the holding company, Clara said, already knowing where this was going, is registered in the name of a property management office in Billings, Webb said. Nobody spoke. Mace, Elias said. Mace, Webb confirmed. Briggs identifies the targets. Mace applies legal pressure through the holding company. They split the proceeds. He looked at Elias. You are not the first person this has happened to. You are the first person who has come into my office with documentation thorough enough to do anything about it. Clara looked at the stack of papers she had carried from the cabin. 3 days of work. Every figure double-checked. Every pattern laid out. She thought about the 6 other property owners, the 3 who had sold, the families displaced from land they had built something on, the specific sustained cruelty of a scheme designed to target people in their most vulnerable moments. She thought about Cora Carter sick and dying while the payments meant for her care were rerouted to a Billings property company by her own brother. She thought about an auction platform and a woman standing in the cold and men deciding her worth in dollars. Webb, she said. Can we add the other 6 properties to the fraud claim? Webb looked at her. If the pattern is documented, the pattern is documented, she said. It's the same pattern, same holding company, same timeline structure. If you can get me access to the county land transfer records for those 6 properties, I can document it in the same format I used for Elias's ledger. Same kind of evidence, same kind of argument. Webb stared at her. That would turn a single fraud case into a systematic scheme prosecution, he said. Yes, Clara said, it would. Briggs would face everything he's owed, Elias said quietly, for a very long time. Webb sat forward. The land transfer records are public. I can have them pulled today. He looked at Clara. How long do you need? How much time do we have before the injunction hearing? The judge scheduled it for 4 days from now. Then I need 3 days, she said. Webb nodded slowly. He looked between her and Elias with the expression of a man who has just watched something shift from a difficult case to a significant one. I'll have the records here by tomorrow morning. Good. Clara picked up her bag. Then we'll be back tomorrow morning. They rode back towards the mountain as the afternoon light failed, and somewhere around the halfway point when the trail narrowed and the trees came close on both sides. Elias said without preamble, You just made this considerably larger than it was this morning. Yes, Clara said. 6 additional properties. Other victims. A systematic scheme prosecution. That's not a local dispute anymore. That draws territorial attention. I know. Briggs will respond in proportion to the threat, Elias said. When he understands the scale of what we're filing, he won't just use lawyers. Clara looked at the trail ahead. I know that too. You're not concerned. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm concerned, she said. But being concerned and stepping back are 2 different things, and I've spent a long time stepping back from things I was concerned about, and it has never once made me safer. She paused. Those 6 families, Elias. The ones who lost their land. Who does something about that if we don't? He was quiet for a moment. You, he said. Apparently. We, she said. And something in the word was deliberate, and she felt him register. It felt the small shift in his posture that was his body acknowledging the precision of the word. We, he agreed. They rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that had changed texture again since the cabin that morning, less the silence of 2 people in proximity, and more the silence of 2 people who have acknowledged without quite saying it that the proximity has become something they are both choosing. They arrived at the cabin as the first stars appeared, and Clara went straight to the table and her documentation, and Elias went to the stove to start dinner. And that division of labor was so natural and so ordinary that neither of them remarked on it, which was itself a kind of remark. She was deep in the land transfer records. Webb had sent preliminary copies ahead with a courier when Elias set a plate beside her without being asked. She didn't look up. Thank you. Eat while it's hot. In a minute. Clara. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had no complete category for patience and concern, and something warmer than either the combination of a man who has watched someone work with full commitment and finds that commitment both admirable and worrying in equal measure. Eat, he said. She put down the pen and ate. He sat across from her and ate his own dinner and didn't say anything else. And when she finished, she picked up the pen again, and he cleared the plates without comment and sat back down and read the preliminary land records she wasn't currently working on, which was the most natural and the most companionable thing she could have imagined, and she did not stop to think about that too carefully, because she had 3 days and 6 property cases, and she could think about the other thing later. She worked until midnight. At midnight, she said, "There's a pattern in the timing." Elias, who had fallen asleep in his chair with the land records across his lap, opened his eyes without apparent confusion and said, "What pattern?" Each target was approached during a period of documented vulnerability, a death in the family, a legal dispute, a hard winter that reduced income. In every case, Briggs appears to have had advance knowledge of the vulnerability before making his move. She turned her pages toward him. He didn't find these people randomly. Someone was telling him when families were weak. Elias looked at the pages. Horace Dunn, he said. The telegraph office. Every one of these properties is in the territory served by Black Pine Ridge as the nearest commercial center, Clara said. Every one of these families would have used Horace's telegraph at some point during the period of vulnerability. Deaths, legal notices, financial communications, they all go through the telegraph. Elias was completely awake now. He's been feeding information to Briggs, he said, for years. And Briggs has been feeding Mace, Clara said. 3-way operation. Dunn identifies the vulnerable target. Briggs applies financial pressure through the supply chain or other means. Mace applies legal pressure through the holding company. She looked at Elias steadily. We don't just have a fraud case, Elias. We have a conspiracy. The fire crackled. Webb is going to need to know tonight, Elias said. I'll have the written summary ready by dawn, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the thing she still didn't have a complete word for, the warm infrastructure, the thing underneath a smile that was more real than the smile itself. Sleep first, he said. 3 hours. I'll keep the fire going. I can work. Clara. His voice was gentle and final in equal measure. 3 hours. You think better rested. You know that. She looked at him. She looked at the papers. She put down the pen. 3 hours, she said. 3 hours, he confirmed. She lay down on her bed and pulled the blankets up and looked at the ceiling and listened to the fire and told herself she was going to run through the conspiracy timeline in her head while she rested to organize her thoughts to use the time productively. She was asleep in 4 minutes. When she woke, the cabin was still dark, but the fire was bright and fresh, which meant Elias had added wood recently, and her documentation had been carefully covered with a clean cloth to protect it from any sparks, and on the table beside her pen was a cup of coffee still steaming. She sat up. He was at the door, already dressed, clearly about to go out and check the horses. He glanced at her. 3 hours and 12 minutes, he said. She picked up the coffee. It was exactly the right temperature, not scalding, not merely warm, but the precise heat of coffee that someone has timed to be drinkable when a particular person wakes up. He had been watching. He had noticed. "Elias," she said. He paused with his hand on the door. She thought about everything she could say. About the coffee and the fire and the documented conspiracy and the auction platform and the 12 minutes and the chess pieces carved from pine. She thought about all the words available to her, which were many, because she was a woman who had spent her life being precise about language. She chose the simplest ones. "We're going to win this," she said. He looked at her across the cabin. "Yes," he said. "We are." He went out the door, and Clara Whitmore sat in the warmth of a fire that someone had kept burning through the night, and picked up her pen and went back to work. The dawn of the hearing day came in cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that made the world look sharp-edged and permanent, every pine tree and ridgeline cut against the pale sky, like something that intended to last. Clara had been awake since 4, not from anxiety though. The anxiety was there, a low, steady hum beneath everything else. The reasonable response of a person who understood exactly what was at stake and had done everything she could, and was now at the moment where doing gave way to waiting. She had been awake because her mind was running the arguments one final time, checking the documentation, the way you check a structure before you put weight on it, looking for the weak points, the places where a hostile attorney could find purchase. She found none. That didn't stop her looking. Elias came in from the horses at 5:30 and found her at the table with the documentation stacked and organized, and her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. He looked at the cold coffee. He took the cup from her hands, poured it out, and refilled it from the pot on the stove without saying anything about it. She accepted the hot cup and looked at him. "Thank you." "You didn't sleep much." "I slept enough." She paused. "I kept thinking about the Mace argument. Webb is going to lead with the original land claim, predating the marriage, which is solid. But Briggs's attorney is going to argue that Cora's common law interest transferred regardless of the original claim date, and Webb needs to be ready for that with the territorial statute on sole acquisition rights because—" "Clara." "Yes. Webb knows the law," Elias said. "You know the numbers. Let each person do what they're good at." She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right. And the fact that he had said it without condescension, not calm down, or don't worry, but a precise and respectful division of competency, made it land the way advice only lands when it comes from someone who has been paying genuine attention. "You're right," she said. "I know." He sat down across from her. "Are you ready?" She looked at the stacked papers. 3 days of work on the expanded conspiracy case. The 6 additional properties documented with the same rigor she had applied to Elias's ledger. The timeline of Horace Dunn's telegraph communications cross-referenced with the dates of Briggs's moves against each target. The medical payment diversion laid out in language so plain that a hostile reader could not reasonably misinterpret it. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." He nodded once. "Then let's go." They reached Millhaven 2 hours before the hearing. Webb was in his office with Perrin, the accounts examiner, and a man Clara hadn't met, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with the careful measuring eyes of someone whose profession required him to see things accurately rather than conveniently. Webb introduced him as Edmund Gerard, from Patterson's Fur Trading Company in Billings, who had come down the previous day in response to Webb's telegraph and who had spent the evening reviewing the fur pricing documentation. Gerard looked at Clara with the specific attention of a man who has been told something about a person and is deciding how accurately he was told. "You compiled the fur pricing analysis," he said. "I did," Clara said. "The cross-reference to the billings market rates over the 3-year period." "Yes." "Where did you get the billings market figures you used for comparison?" "Memory," Clara said. "My father worked in the fur trade and required me to read the market reports from the age of 10. I have not forgotten them." Gerard looked at her for a long moment. "I verified your figures against our company records last night," he said. "You were accurate to within 1% on every quarterly average for the entire 3-year period." "I know," Clara said. "I don't misremember numbers." A pause. Then Gerard said with the reluctant respect of a man who had expected to be less impressed, "Neither do I." He looked at Webb. "Her analysis is sound. I'll testify to that." Webb looked at Clara with the expression she had become familiar with over the past days, the ongoing recalibration of a man who kept discovering that the woman in front of him was more capable than the previous discovery had suggested. "The injunction hearing is at 9, he said. "The land claim hearing is at 11. I want to walk through the order of argument." They walked through it for 90 minutes. Clara sat at Webb's table and listened and spoke when she needed to speak, and was silent when silence served better, and by the end of it, she understood the shape of the morning with the precision of someone who has studied a terrain before having to cross it. At 8:45, they walked to the courthouse. The Millhaven Courthouse was a 2-story wooden building that aspired to permanence through its architecture columns that were slightly too grand for the structure they supported. Steps that implied a dignity the surrounding mud didn't quite ratify. Clara climbed those steps between Elias and Webb and felt the cold air on her face and thought about an auction platform in the snow. Same cold. Different steps. Different woman in the ways that mattered. The courtroom was already occupied when they entered. Samuel Briggs was at the plaintiff's table with an attorney Clara recognized from the injunction filing. A man named Colton, sharp-faced and expensively dressed in a way that announced he had been brought in from somewhere larger than Millhaven. Hector Mace sat beside Briggs, and Clara looked at him for the first time with the information she now carried about him, and what she saw was a man of about 50, who had organized his face into an expression of aggrieved dignity that did not reach his eyes. His eyes were calculating. She had been around calculating eyes enough to recognize them immediately. Briggs saw her. His expression did something complicated, a compression of the lips, a brief narrowing of the eyes that she cataloged without reacting to. He had expected her to be intimidated. She could read that expectation in the compression. He was revising the expectation now, and she could read that revision too, and what replaced it was not respect, but wariness, which was close enough to what she needed from him. She sat down at Webb's table, folded her hands on her documentation, and looked at the judge's bench. The judge's name was Calloway. He was 60, with the deliberate, unsurprisable manner of someone who had been managing human conflict in a territorial court for long enough that he had developed a very accurate eye for which parties in front of him actually had the facts and which ones had the performance of having the facts. He came in at 9 precisely and looked at the room with that eye and said, "Let's proceed," without ceremony. Colton opened the injunction argument with the confidence of a man who has won on procedure before. The ledger was proprietary store property removed without authorization. The use of it in any proceeding should be stayed until its provenance was determined. He spoke for 8 minutes and made the argument cleanly. Webb stood up and was succinct in a way that Clara had come to understand was one of his primary legal gifts. "Your Honor, the ledger in question is a personal financial record kept by Mr. Carter in his own hand over 12 years, recording his own transactions and expenses. The fact that it records purchases made from a particular business does not make it that business's property any more than a household's grocery list becomes the property of the grocer because it mentions the store by name. The territorial statute on personal financial records is unambiguous on this point." He cited the statute, chapter, and section. Additionally, we have 2 independent accounting professionals present today. Mr. Perrin of the Millhaven Savings and Land Trust, and Mr. Garrard of Patterson's Fur Trading in Billings, who are prepared to testify that the ledger's contents represent a personal financial record, not a business document under any standard accounting classification. Calloway looked at Colton. Response. Colton argued for another 4 minutes. Calloway listened without expression. When Colton finished, the judge looked at the ledger which Webb had placed on the clerk's table, and looked at the 2 expert witnesses, and looked at the plaintiff's table. Injunction denied, he said. The ledger is admitted as personal financial record. We'll proceed to the land claim at 11. Court recessed. Colton's face did something brief and controlled. Briggs behind him did nothing at all, which was more informative. The stillness of a man who had expected this outcome and was already on his next move. Clara looked at Elias. He looked at her. "One?" she said quietly. He almost smiled. During the recess, they sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Webb reviewed his notes, and Perrin and Garrard spoke to each other in the professional shorthand of men from the same field. And Clara kept her eyes on the door of the courtroom and thought about what came next. What came next was Hector Mace's land claim argument, which Colton presented with slightly less confidence than the injunction had warranted because the injunction had been the stronger of his 2 cases, and he knew it. The common law inheritance argument for Mace had genuine legal weight, and Colton made the most of it. Cora Carter's interest in the property, the intestate death, the established territorial precedent for inheritance transferred to the nearest male relative. Webb countered with the original territorial claim filed by Elias Carter alone 19 years prior, before the marriage under sole acquisition provisions that the territorial statute explicitly protected from subsequent marital interest claims without a recorded joint ownership amendment. No such amendment had ever been filed. The land was Elias's under the statute and always had been. Calloway asked 3 questions. Colton answered 2 of them adequately and the 3rd badly. Webb answered all 3 of his with the particular precision of someone who has spent 3 days with someone who does not misremember numbers. Then Calloway said, "I'm prepared to rule on the land claim. However, I understand there are additional matters relating to these parties that counsel wishes to raise." "Yes, Your Honor," Webb said. "We wish to file a fraud claim against Samuel Briggs and Hector Mace jointly in relation to a systematic scheme of financial fraud conducted against Mr. Carter and at least 6 other property owners in this territory. The documentation has been prepared and is ready for submission." The room changed temperature. Briggs's stillness broke. It was small a shift of weight, a hand that moved to the table surface, but Clara saw it and she knew what it meant. He had anticipated the fraud claim. He had not anticipated the words 6 other property owners. Colton leaned over to Briggs and said something in a low voice. Briggs shook his head once short and sharp. Calloway looked at the documentation Webb was presenting to the clerk. The organized cross-referenced, timeline-backed case that Clara had built over 3 days from the land transfer records and the ledger and the Billings market figures and the telegraph cross-references and the medical payment diversion. All of it. "This is substantial," Calloway said, looking at the pages. "It is, Your Honor," Webb said. "We also wish to note for the record that the scheme involved the interception of medical care payments made by Mr. Carter for his late wife's treatment during her final illness. Those payments totaling over $200 were routed through the general store account to a property management company in Billings, registered in the name of Hector Mace, and there is documented evidence that the doctor and medical suppliers involved in Mrs. Carter's care were not paid in full during the period of her illness." The courtroom was very quiet. Calloway looked at Mace. Mace's carefully organized expression had come apart at the edges. His hands on the table in front of him were no longer still. Clara looked at Elias. He was looking at Mace, and his face was the face of a man who has carried something heavy for a very long time and is now, in this specific moment, setting it down. Not without pain. The setting down of a heavy thing always involves the pain of whatever the weight had been pressing on, but with a finality that had its own kind of relief. Calloway set the documentation down. "I'm entering the land claim in favor of the defendant Elias Carter on the grounds of sole acquisition statute," he said. "On the fraud matter, I'm ordering a full evidentiary hearing to commence in 30 days. In the interim, I'm issuing a hold on all business operations of the Black Pine General Store, pending the outcome of the fraud proceedings, and I'm ordering Mr. Mace to surrender his travel documents to the court, pending the same." He looked at the plaintiff's table over the top of his glasses. "Counselor Colton, I'd strongly advise your clients to use the next 30 days constructively." Colton said, "Yes, Your Honor," in the tone of a man whose fee had just increased substantially. Briggs said nothing. Mace said nothing. Calloway left the bench. The room moved around them, the particular movement of a courtroom when the formal moment ends, and the human reality of what has just happened begins to settle over everyone present. Webb was speaking to Perrin. Gerard was making notes. The clerk was collecting documents. Clara sat still at the table. She looked at the place where the documentation had been her 3 days, her father's lessons. Her 12 years of numbers carried in her memory like a second language. The case that Briggs had dismissed as a destitute woman's personal vendetta. The evidence that Colton had tried to exclude and Calloway had admitted, and Perrin and Gerard had confirmed. She had built something that held. Elias sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. "The land claim," she said. "Settled," he said. "The fraud case goes to full hearing. In 30 days. "Briggs isn't finished," she said. "He'll have 30 days to cover, Clara." His voice was quiet and certain. "He's finished. He doesn't know it yet, but the kind of man who only operates when no one is looking at him is finished the moment someone is." He paused. "You made sure someone is looking." She looked at him. "We made sure," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "We did." They were the last ones to leave the courtroom, and when they came out onto the steps of the Millhaven courthouse, the day had warmed slightly, still cold. Montana. Cold, the kind that didn't apologize for itself, but the angle of the sun had shifted and the light was different. The particular quality of winter light that carries a suggestion, not a promise of something less brutal ahead. Briggs was standing at the bottom of the steps. He had dismissed Colton, or Colton had excused himself, and Mace was nowhere visible, and Briggs stood alone at the bottom of the courthouse steps, with his hat in his hands. Not as a gesture of courtesy, Clara thought, but because he had taken it off at some point and not yet decided what to do with it. He looked older than he had at the auction, the specific aging of a man who has just watched the structure of a plan he has spent years building develop a crack he cannot repair. He looked at Elias. "You had help," he said. The tone was not quite hostile and not quite neutral. The tone of a man trying to be something and not quite achieving it. "I did," Elias said. Briggs looked at Clara. She looked back at him with the same steadiness she had used at Webb's table. The same steadiness she had used on the auction platform in the snow when she had decided not to cry. The steadiness that was not hardness, but its own kind of strength. The kind that develops in people who have had no choice but to find it. Briggs said, "You did this." It was not a question. "The numbers did this," Clara said. "I just knew how to read them." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him decide several things in succession. Anger dismissal, something that might have been a grudging and unwilling acknowledgement, and watched him settle on none of them completely, which told her that whatever Samuel Briggs was, he was not entirely without the ability to recognize when he had been genuinely defeated. He put his hat back on and walked away. Clara watched him go. Elias watched him go. When he was out of sight, Clara let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding, and felt the particular physical release of sustained tension, leaving the body, the loosening of shoulders, the slow return of normal breathing, the way the world looks slightly different when you have been braced against something for so long that you forgot you were bracing. "All right," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." They rode north out of Millhaven in the afternoon light, and the ride back to the mountain was different from every ride they had made before it. Not easier exactly. The cold was the same cold and the trail was the same trail, but something in the quality of the silence between them had changed, had settled into something that felt less like the quiet of two people who were being careful around each other and more like the quiet of two people who no longer needed to be. An hour out of Mill Haven, Elias said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "When this is finished, the fraud hearing, the 30 days, whatever comes after, what do you want to do?" Clara looked at the trail ahead. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, the way she thought about everything, not deflecting, not offering what she thought was expected, but actually sitting with it and finding the honest answer. "I want to stay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "On the mountain." "In the cabin," she said. "With the chess set and the supply ledger and the coffee that's always the right temperature." She paused. "With you." The trail was narrow here, the trees close on both sides, and the horses moved through it in single file, which meant she couldn't see his face. She heard him, though, the brief quiet sound of a man receiving something he had been hoping for and had not let himself count on. "That's what I was hoping you'd say," he said. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "How long?" She considered. "The bear," she said. "When you went outside to talk to the bear and came back in, and I asked what you said to it, and you said you told it the winter was hard enough without getting itself shot by a nervous man." She paused. "That was the moment I stopped looking for the catch." He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she had said too much, given too much of the interior accounting that she usually kept closer. Then he said, "The chess game, the second one, when you won by doing the opposite of what I expected. What about it?" "That was the moment I understood that you were going to be a permanent disruption to my understanding of how things work," he said. "And I found that I didn't mind." Clara smiled, and it was the unguarded kind, the kind she didn't usually let happen where people could see it. "A permanent disruption," she said. "That's one of the better things anyone has called me." He laughed, actually laughed. The sound of it unexpected and real and warm. The laugh of a man who doesn't do it often enough that the sound of it is unfamiliar even to himself. She stored the sound of it with the same precision she stored numbers, because she understood it was something she intended to hear more of and wanted to have the original clearly in memory. They reached the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks and the cold settled in hard for the evening, and Elias took the horses to the stable, and Clara went inside and built the fire up, and stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the room that had been 3 weeks ago. The most foreign and unexpected place she had ever found herself, and was now the most known. The ledger on the table. The chess set on the shelf. The cedar smell of the blankets. The loose floorboard by the door that you stepped over without thinking about it because your feet had learned where it was. The coffee tin by the window. The 2 beds that had over the past week become one which neither of them had discussed, and neither of them needed to discuss, because some things settle themselves when the conditions are right, and the people involved are honest enough to let them. She looked at all of it. She thought about her cloth bag with the broken comb, and the torn Bible, and the small folded letter she had stopped reading because the words hurt. The bag was still under the bed, but she hadn't opened it in 2 weeks, because she had acquired other things, not objects mostly, but the more durable kind of acquisitions. The knowledge of what it felt like to wake up safe. The knowledge of what it felt like to be useful in ways that mattered. The knowledge of what it felt like to have built something real out of the specific skills she had spent her life carrying and never been fully permitted to use. Elias came in from the stable and stopped in the doorway for a moment, looking at her standing in the middle of the cabin. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking." "What about this time?" She turned to look at him. "About how much has changed in 3 weeks, and how much it doesn't feel like 3 weeks." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He came the rest of the way in and closed the door against the cold, and she moved to the stove to start dinner, and he hung up his coat and came to stand beside her, not to help because she didn't need help, but simply to be there, in the particular way he had developed of being present without demanding anything from the presence, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Clara." "Yes, I bought your freedom at that auction," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I didn't buy you. I know the difference, and I meant what I said on the platform. But I bought the space around you, the room to breathe. He paused. What I didn't know was that giving you room to breathe was going to... He stopped. She turned to look at him. Was going to what? She said. Was going to give me the same thing, he said. I had been living without it for so long that I'd stopped knowing it was missing. Clara looked at this man. This large, quiet, principled, sometimes infuriating man who talked to bears and carved chess pieces and kept 12 years of meticulous records and had spent 14 years alone on a mountain and had still on a specific November morning in 1874 found it impossible to walk past an auction platform without doing something about what he saw there. She thought about what that said about him. She thought about the fact that she had been the one on the platform and had still somehow been the one to walk away with the better end of the transaction. Not the gold, not the freedom from debt, but the thing underneath those things, the thing that actually mattered. She had been seen by a man who was paying real attention, who did not reduce her to her circumstances, or her usefulness, or her debt, who had looked at a woman on a freezing auction platform and seen a person worth taking his hat off for. Everything else, the ledger, the courthouse, the fraud case, the chess games and the bear and the coffee at the right temperature, everything else had grown from that single root. Elias, she said, you gave me room to breathe. I want you to know what I did with it. I know what you did with it, he said. Tell me. He looked at her directly with the dark, steady eyes of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. You built a case that protected my land. You documented a fraud that will restore what was taken from 6 families. You kept a fire going and made coffee and beat me at chess and refused to be less than you are for even a single moment. He paused. You gave a lonely man on a mountain a reason to come home. Clara felt the words land in the place where things that are true always land, not in the mind which analyzes, but somewhere deeper, the place that simply knows. You were already home, she said. I just made it warmer. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and his hand was large and calloused and warm from the cabin, and she held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. Outside Montana, winter was still doing what Montana winter did, relentless and cold, and entirely indifferent to the small warm spaces that human beings carved inside it. The snow on the ridge, the trees moving in the night wind, the vast impersonal dark of a landscape that did not know or care about auction platforms and courthouses and fraud hearings and chess games and the specific feeling of coffee at exactly the right temperature. It didn't know, but they did. And in the spring, when the snow melted off the mountain paths and the first riders came up from Black Pine Ridge with news that the fraud hearing had concluded, and Samuel Briggs had been found liable on 7 counts, and Hector Mace had surrendered his travel documents, and the 6 families were beginning the process of recovering what had been taken from them. The people who brought that news up the mountain found a cabin with smoke coming from the chimney, and a woman who opened the door before they knocked, as though she had heard them coming, and a man who came to stand beside her in the doorway with his hand at the small of her back, as naturally as breathing. They told her the news. She nodded once with the calm of someone who had known the outcome before it was official, because she had built the case, and she had trusted the case, and she did not need the confirmation to feel the truth of it. She thanked them and fed them and sent them back down the mountain with fresh coffee and enough provisions for the ride. Then she closed the door and turned to Elias, who was watching her with that expression, the warm infrastructure, the thing underneath the smile. It's done, she said. It is, he said. All of it. All of it. Clara Whitmore looked around the cabin, her home built from trust and documentation and chess games, and a man who had taken his hat off on an auction platform in the snow, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized after a life of not recognizing it as peace. She had come to this mountain with a cloth bag and a broken comb and $42 of debt. She was leaving nothing behind. Because the woman the whole town had called worthless had walked into a courtroom with 12 years of numbers and walked out with the truth. And the man who had bought her freedom had discovered that the cost of doing the right thing was not in the end a cost at all. It was the best investment either of them ever made.